Hey everybody, Ron Gilligo with Wings Photography in the Kingfisher blind this morning, shooting video, diving kingfishers on the Canon R5 Mk. Got the 200 to 800 on there. Great video combination for fast action video. So if you're interested in how I set up my Canon R5 Mk to shoot birds in flight, video, not stills, stay tuned.
Hey everybody, Ron Bielefeld, Whistling Wings Photography. Got another video for you. R5 Mk, R1. Got it right that time. Before last video, I kind of messed them up. But anyway, this is about video. I've been getting requests saying, hey, do a setup of the R5 Mk and the R1 for video. Because we've got two really powerful video cameras in these camera bodies. Not just stills, you can take awesome video. I take my video with the 200 to 800 on either one of these cameras. So that's what you're gonna see today. Have some samples of video I've taken, and this isn't just about setting up for video. I'm not talking about putting it on a tripod, static thing out there, taking video of it. Sure. You can do that. How about birds in flight? Fast birds in flight. So we're going to set up these cameras. We're going to go into the menu. I'm not going to go into the menu of both of them. They're basically the same. So I'll pick one. We'll go into the menus, set it up for video, and then we'll talk about maybe a little bit of a technique for shooting video on these cameras. And you can see that not only can you shoot the staticky stuff, slow stuff, but these cameras are capable of shooting very fast subjects, gaining quickly on the camera, flying away from the camera quickly, all that kind of stuff, and in very low light. The autofocus systems of these cameras are the best I've ever used when it comes to hybrid bodies for video, when it comes to shooting really low light. And that's the great thing about video. You can shoot video in much lower light conditions than you can stills. I'm talking about action now, not the static stuff. So here we go. We're going to jump into the menu of one of these cameras. We'll go through the setup, and then we'll talk about some of this other stuff. All right, here we are in the Canon R5 Mk, and you can see in the upper left-hand corner we are in video mode, and we're in manual exposure, and that's how I shoot my stills, that's how I shoot my video, in manual, because it just gives you the flexibility you need to get your exposures right. And when you shoot video, it's really important to get your exposures right. Even more important than in stills, a little less flexibility there when it comes to changing your exposure in post-processing. So anyway, you can also see a little bit more about how I have my camera set up. I've got a very large flexible zone chosen. And then from here we'll go into the menu, and you can see that I'm going to have it set up for eye detection being enabled. I find this works really well on static, slow moving, and fast moving, in this case, for the most part, flying subjects. So anyway, let's dive into the menu. We'll start at the very top of the first menu, the shooting menu. Movie record size, 4KU, 119.9p, 120 frames per second, and intra, that's intra-frame. Dive into that, get deeper in here. You can see how this is set up. This is set up differently than the older R5, some of the other cameras now, the R5 Mark II and the R1, where you have your main dial, where you can choose from the main menu options within the movie record size menu, 4KU, 119 frames per second for fast action, so you can slow it down. I like to slow diving kingfishers, ospreys, flying and stuff like that down sometimes, and shooting at 119 or 120 frames per second basically is the way to go. Hey, you may want to shoot at 60 frames per second, but I wouldn't go any slower than that or lower than that. 4K, there's a lot of different options in here. You can shoot 4K define, but that's going to limit you. Let's go over here and look what happens when you go to 4K define. 119 frames per second is not available to you. So just to keep it simple, 4KU, 119 frames per second or 60 frames per second. And then we have intra, and you can shoot, I'm shooting just plain intra frame. You could shoot intra frame light, or you could shoot LGOP. Intra provides the most information. File sizes are bigger, but it works for me. This is what I like to do. This is how I like to set things up. Let me just say a little bit more about, these are your compression settings, compression rate, if you want to put it that way. If we move over to LGOP, long group of pictures, that used to be termed IPB, like the R5, other cameras before the R5 Mark II and the R1. Intra frame compression, that was all I. That's what the I stood for. And intra-frame just means every frame contains all the information. Thus, bigger file sizes. But you can do more with it. It's actually easier for your computer to handle too in post-processing than if you go with LGOP or IPB, whatever you want to call it. So I'm not going to spend too much time explaining all these things. You can go on to Google, and there's all sorts of explanations of what these different compression choices mean. Let's back out. Let's go down to high frame rate is disabled. The neat thing about the Canon R5 Mark II and the Canon R1 is you can now shoot in high frame rate without actually having to enable high frame rate. Before, you had to enable high frame rate in this menu selection in order to even get to the option of shooting 120 frames per second. But now you don't. Now let's go over this real quick. So I know this could be somewhat confusing. Okay, so let's use the original R5 as an example. Under movie record size, you couldn't even choose 120 frame per second frame rate without first going to the high frame rate menu item and enabling it. Then you could set it to 120 frames per second and it would record in 120 frames per second. But when you would go into DaVinci Resolve or Premiere Pro or whatever to then edit or post-process your video, it would play back automatically in slow motion. It would be put on a 30 frame per second timeline, for example, and that was kind of weird. It's like, well, why is it doing that? Well, you could still, all those frames are still there. You just had to speed up your timeline to get it to play back at normal speed, real-time speed. The other thing was it didn't record sound. So now in the R5 Mark II and the Canon R1, this is separated. So now you do not have to enable high frame rate where I am right now in the menu. You can just go right to 119.9p or 120 frames per second and record in that frame rate and also record sound. So that's an improvement. When you take a video shot, these parameters set, it plays back on a 120 frame per second timeline and it looks normal speed, and then you can slow it down to get your slow motion if that's what you want to do. I think the reason Canon did it the old way to begin with was because it was hard for some computers to deal with 120 frames per second actually playing at 120 frames per second. So they basically defaulted it to playing on a 30 frame per second timeline. But now you have your choice. If you have it set like this and you go down and you enable high frame rate, it says, will play back slowly, audio is not recorded. So that gets you back to kind of how the original R5 did it, for example. So anyway, moving on, keep that disabled. I want sound with my 120 frame per second recordings, and I want to then be able to potentially slow them down by 50% or down to 25% of the original frame rate to get my slow motion. Main recording format, XF-AVCS YCC422, 10-bit. All right, let's go into this real quick and we'll decipher this. This is generally what would be considered a fairly high quality recording setting and one that compresses at a decent rate so your files aren't super huge. We'll go into and explain what all of these different parts of this menu mean. In general, this is a video recording format that Canon specifically designed for high-quality professional video capture. It's the XF-AVC is a codec. And then if you look at the YCC is the color space, 422 being the color sampling rate, and the 10-bit being the depth for the color. So enhancing the color accuracy and detail in the image. Essentially, it's a high quality setting for recording video with a good balance between image quality and file size. Specifically, the XF-AVC is a proprietary thing from Canon. It's a video codec from Canon based on the H.264 standard. It's offering a good compression to image quality balance. That's what they say anyway. The S stands for small or lightweight version of that codec, and it just gives you better file sizes. We already deal with pretty big file sizes, so we don't want to have anything larger than we need. Color space, where the video signal is represented. That's the YCC part. I'm not going to go into that in big detail here. 422 is a color sampling, if you really want to get into all that kind of stuff. 10-bit is just the depth, wider color range of colors, smoother gradients, things like that. So anyway, that's basically deciphering that main recording format that I choose to shoot in most of the time. Movie cropping, that's disabled. Dual shooting, stills and movie, that's a whole nother video. That's turned off for this. Just normal shooting of, or capturing of video clips, that's turned off. Let's move on down. Sound recording is on. My audio format is a relatively rich one. Decent audio quality coming off of that. If we go into audio settings, if you plug in an external microphone, which if I'm looking for good quality audio, I will. I have a Rode video mic that I'll put on the camera and not use the built-in microphone. It's not hooked up right now, so it's turned off. Audio status. Again, we're not going to go deep into this stuff here. Move over. Not a whole lot going on here. Whoop. Thing is touchy. Ace stop increments for your aperture. Why not? For video, you want a little more fine control over your exposures. This gives you that. You can keep it on a third if you want. But why not go with more control over less? Nothing else to really talk about in here that's important. Nothing in here. You can pretty much, these are standard default settings. Again, standard settings. Nothing changed in here from the default. IS stabilizer mode. Digital IS turned off on these cameras. I've not needed it on the Canon R5 Mk II or the Canon R1 with the 200-800. You remember, if you look back at my R5 video on video settings, digital IS was turned on. Not anymore. IS mode on the lens is turned on, and man, it works great. We'll talk about that more later. Nothing else to do in here. Zebra settings off. I want to mention this. We can talk about metadata and time codes. I'm not trying to sync. Okay, let's do that. If I would quit, going the other way. Let's just talk about time code for a second. I'm not trying to sync up a bunch of cameras. So I don't mess with time code. If you have multiple cameras going and you want to sync all your time codes and all that kind of stuff so that you can easily sync things up, post-processing, or more easily anyway, go for it. I'm generally recording on one camera, so time code really isn't an issue. Zebra settings. Well, why don't you have zebras turned on? I just don't like it. I can see my exposure. I can turn on my histogram when I want through the viewfinder. I don't like things cluttering up my viewfinder when I'm shooting video, just like I don't like it when I'm shooting stills. So I don't need that aid. I don't find it an issue keeping my exposures correct. So there you go. I keep it turned off. Shooting information display and all. Set it up how you want it. Personal preference doesn't have any real bearing on how video is recorded, how good it looks. Standard stuff. Standby low resolution on. It helps save battery because when you shoot video, you're using a lot of battery power. On the R5 Mk II, the batteries, if you're using a grip, and I'm used to cooling grip. Talk about that. We'll also talk about ND filters. But on the R1, you can't put a cooling grip on that. It doesn't overheat. For what I've been doing, The R5 Mark II gets hot pretty quick. The cooling grip helps. But it also allows 2 batteries. And that's the point here, is the battery life on the R5 Mark II I find with video shooting is really, really good. The R1, not so good. Man, I'll tell you, in general, the R1 uses battery a lot more than the R3 did, a lot more than the R5 Mark II does. So anyway, even though it's got a bigger battery, built-in grip, and all that kind of stuff, wow, that camera's pretty battery hungry. I digress. All right, so moving on, we're not going to talk about C-Log or anything like that. Not shooting in log formats. Let's move on to something really important. Autofocus. Of course, movie servo autofocus is enabled. And it's really important if you're shooting birds in flight that it servos with your bird as it's getting closer or further away. So that's pretty obvious. The autofocus area is set to the flexible zone 3 for me, and you saw that at the very beginning of the video. I have it set to a pretty big zone. You could almost go full size, whole area. That's what you want to call it. I don't. I keep a zone active, and it works well for me. The focus mode down here is an autofocus. That's a pretty obvious setting. Subject to detect. Animals, that's obvious. Eye detection set to auto. I find it works good, works well. For video, we're not getting into registering any kind of people because we're shooting animals here. Very important setting. I'm going to say it again. Very important setting. If you're shooting action, fast subjects, and you want the autofocus to be able to keep up with that subject gaining on the camera quickly, moving away from the camera quickly, switching tracked subjects set to responsive. I know this is about switching subjects and you'd think locked on is better because it's going to not switch off the subject then when you have it. It goes against backgrounds and things. I'm telling you, I have found that having it set to responsive is really important because to get on the subject initially, here comes the osprey in with nesting material. Coming over the trees, you want the autofocus to grab that new subject quickly. You need this setting for it to do that, responsive setting for switching track subjects. Once the camera has the subject, I've found it stays on it really well, even if you have it set to the responsive setting here. All right. Movie servo autofocus speed, the next really important setting. Have it set all the way to the fast side, +2. It needs to be able to keep up with your subjects. This will help. You don't want it transitioning really slowly. I'm not looking for cinematic effect. I want it to keep up, focus quickly. Servo tracking sensitivity for movies, again, on the plus side of the settings, all the way up to +3, responsive. Goes back to everything I was just talking about. Keeping up with these subjects. And it still works well even if you're doing slower subjects. Like I do with stills, I play for the action stuff. I have things set for action. For movies, for video, whatever you want to call it, I have it set for the action stuff. If slower stuff happens, it can still handle it. I'm finding it works well. Those are the really important settings. Drive when autofocus, all the rest of this stuff, whatever. Manual focus stuff doesn't matter. Okay, so we're going to skip along. Like I said, I have the cooling grip attached to my R5 Mark II. If you're shooting the R1, can't have that, doesn't exist. Bigger camera body doesn't get hot as quickly as the R5 Mark II does. I find the cooling grip really helps, especially here in Florida, hot, humid. When you have the cooling grip set up on the camera, attached to the camera body, you get the cooling fan settings. You can go in and you can turn it off. You can have it on at the set speed. You can have it on high speed and standby. It gives you the warning that you may hear the fan noise when you're recording video. I have to deal with that. Go down here. Go out. Fan rotation speed, medium. I find medium is the best for me. Haven't had to put it on high. Low doesn't do anything, I don't think. So medium is where I generally keep this setting. If you shoot a lot of video, especially if you shoot longer clips, especially if you shoot in hot and humid conditions, getting the cooling grip may be a great way to go for you. I found it is great for me. I generally don't use the vertical grip controls when I'm shooting the R5 Mark II, so I keep my cooling grip on all the time. I have the other grip. I have the regular vertical grip with all the duplicated controls for vertical shooting, but I generally keep my cooling grip on because it gives me the most important thing, and that's 2 batteries. Now we move on to another really important group of settings, I guess you can call it that. Let's go into custom buttons, and I'll show you how I have my buttons set up. So you notice when you're in video, the video side of things, there's nothing that you can do with the half press of the shutter button. You go back here, that's a separate option. Shutter button functions for movies. I don't use it for movies. I don't use it for capturing video, but I just wanted to point that out. Okay, so let's, oh boy, I'm all over the place today. Here we go, over to the movie shooting side of things, and we're going to go right on down to the autofocus on button. And you'll notice that I have it set for starting and stopping my recordings. I don't like the red record buttons on these cameras. I never have developed muscle memory for them. I'm shooting stills and video often back and forth. Shooting stills, then I'm shooting video, then I'm shooting stills again. And I set up my back buttons that I use for my autofocus for stills to do video functions for me, because obviously I have muscle memory for where those buttons are and I can hit them in an instant. I don't have to think about anything. And those of you know that the less you have to think about your camera and its operation and all that kind of stuff, the more you can concentrate on getting the imagery that you're out to get. So I set up my autofocus on button to stop and start my video recording. It's a toggle. Super quick. That's how I do it. The asterisk button, which for stills I have set up for an autofocus area. Here, I have it set up for an autofocus area. But it does something different. For those of you who have shot Canon bodies like the R5, the R3, the R5 Mark II, the R1 for video, you know that autofocus in video mode is completely different than autofocus in stills mode. But you can bump the autofocus. You can tell the autofocus to refocus right now. And sometimes that's important because it's not getting on the subject that you're trying to get it to grab onto quick enough, and you can tell it, do it now. Don't be cycling around stuff, do it now. That's what this asterisk button is set up for. It's set up for metering an autofocus start, and it's what I call an autofocus bump. It tells the autofocus to focus instantly, right now, and you can pump it. Say, grab the subject. Once it grabs the subject, you let go of that button. It's not like servo autofocus in stills where you hold it down and it continues to focus. It's a kind of instant bump, and that's it, no matter how long you hold the button down. You can pump it. You can go focus, focus, focus. Once it grabs it, you let go of the button. You let movie servo autofocus take over. It's a great thing to have. For me, it's a necessity. It really is. It gets me on my subject quicker than the camera sometimes wants to do it. We go down to the autofocus point button, the far right back button on the camera, and I have it set to pause movie servo autofocus. This is the thing about the original R5 that used to drive me crazy. You can set your camera up, if you have the R5, the original R5, to use this function, pause servo autofocus. But it will not do it when you're actually recording. You have to pause the actual recording, then pause the autofocus, and then start the recording again. And if you want to reactivate servo movie autofocus, you have to stop the recording, hit the button, and get the servo going again, the autofocus going again, and then start your recording. Ugh, no! R5 Mark II, the R1, you can pause and restart servo movie autofocus while you're actually recording. That's the way it should be. That's the way it is. That's the way it is in the R3, things like that. So there you go. It's really important to be able to pause the servo autofocus. Remember, we have, and I said that it works pretty well even on static subjects, we have the autofocus set to very responsive settings, which is great for when birds are flying around really fast, when they land on the perch, and you've got focus on that bird just to be safe so that the autofocus doesn't decide for some dumb reason to focus on the background. You've got focus on your bird, it's now perched, you can pause the autofocus when it's focused on the bird, and you don't have to worry about it refocusing on something other than your bird. Now, right away it's a toggle again. You can turn it back on when it looks like the bird may fly again. You can turn the servo autofocus back on even as you're recording. These are the three buttons, these three back buttons, the autofocus on button, the asterisk button, and the autofocus point button. This is how I have them set up, and I've gotten really used to this, and I can deal with just about any video shooting scenario now on the fly, very quickly, almost instantly, and I'm getting some decent video clips this way. So this is how I have it set up. Maybe that'll work for you, maybe it won't. I'm just telling you, this is what I'm doing, and it works great for me. Pick what you like, do something different. Hey, it's up to you. The rest of this stuff I haven't done anything with. It really doesn't come into play for me. We're pretty much done with the most important settings for shooting birds in flight, fast action video clips on the R5 Mark II and the R1. There's other things you can mess around in here with, but for the most part, same exposure for new app. These settings are basically the same as they are for my still shooting. It comes into play with the Canon 200 to 800 millimeter zoom. I don't want my exposures changing when I'm zooming in and out, because with video you're zooming in and out a lot. And I want my exposures to stay the same, so that's set the same. Everything else is pretty much the same. So there you go. Those are the major menu setup items that I've done, how I've set them up for video. I've gone into a little bit of detail about some of what these settings are and what they mean. Hopefully that'll help you. So now let's get out of the menu and we'll talk about some other things that I think are really important for shooting video with these cameras. Okay, we're back. Got the cameras here. It's important, I guess, right? My phone. Don't need that out here. These we kind of need. All right, so there you go. You saw the menus. My menu setup, my setup, whatever you want to call it, for video shooting. And let's take a look at some examples. Birds in flight. Belted kingfishers flying away, flying back at the camera. Sitting on a perch. Other birds just walking along, foraging along edge of a pond. Ospreys flying in with nesting material. All that kind of stuff. It's a lot of fun to shoot video with these cameras if you have them set up right. And you get them to act mostly the way you want. Now, sometimes it's frustrating, and I will say that. Shooting video, action video, These cameras have gotten so good now with the autofocus and stuff that shooting relatively static stuff has really gotten to a point where it's pretty foolproof. But still, shooting action really fast, birds in flight with this stuff can be difficult in that it mostly comes down to the autofocus system doing what you want it to do when you want it to do it. And it can be frustrating. I tell people all the time that I'm helping get into video to be patient and just understand that it's always going to be that way for the most part, unless more developments as far as, technology and stuff come along that make it, even better, which will probably happen. But for right now, I mean, the autofocus systems have gotten so much better at tracking fast subjects in video mode against dirty backgrounds and things like that than they even were back, say, when we were shooting the R5, which wasn't that, 5 years ago. So it's probably going to get better moving forward, but just be patient, understand that it can be, it's a tough thing to do, especially if you're doing longer clips. Following a bird for a long time, something's going to go out of whack with the autofocus more than likely. Overheating, let's talk about that. It's still an issue when you're shooting 120 frames per second. It's hot out. R5 Mark II especially, it's going to get hot. And I mentioned already the cooling grip that Canon has for the R5 Mark II to help remedy that. Intake here, fan in there, room for 2 batteries in here, and ports. Oh, got to get the camera in the right exit ports for the air here. It helps. And like I said, I have it set on medium fan speed for the most part, and it helps a lot. In really cooler conditions, if it's in the 40s or something like that, and it's windy and things, you don't even need the fan on. Just turn it off. But I always keep it on. The grip on my body, because I'm always finding myself shooting video, it seems, these days. Might be shooting stills, but then something happens that's better for video. Go ahead and shoot video. The grip's on there, so I don't have to worry about overheating. Why does every bird that I shoot have white and black on it, or white and light and dark, right? Well, that's just birds. They're highly dynamic when it comes to colors. And so it can be a real trick when you're shooting video to keep your exposures in line, especially with bright colors, very light colors, and really bright light. You can't control your exposure as easily in video as you can in stills, because your shutter speed, I'm not talking about frame rate now, you're shooting, let's say you're shooting 120 frames per second. Well, guess what? That means your shutter speed of your camera needs to be set at 1/250th of a second. Not much higher than that. Not much lower than that. You don't want to go lower. We're talking about dealing with bright conditions. So then you have aperture and ISO to control, keep things dark enough so you're not blowing out those highlights. I don't want to be shooting at f13, f20. Keep those in line because I can't deal with shutter speed again. Remember that. So we use ND filters like these. These are made by Freewell. I like Freewell systems, filters. They're magnetic. You put this ring on the front element of your lens, and then the filters just magnetically attach. So they're, well, it's hard to do it now because I'm holding the ring, but anyway, pop on, pop off, pop on, pop off. Works great. I love it. And you need them, because now you pop that thing on there when it's really bright out and you're shooting a bird with white on it. And now I can keep my aperture at f8 where I want it, not at f20 where I don't want it, because that's going to, you start stopping down that much, it affects autofocus performance, believe me. So I can keep it where I want it. I keep the separation of my subject from the background, because again, at f20, everything's pretty much coming into focus. Background starts to blend more with your foreground and your subject. So if you want to keep that separation, sometimes I get lazy. I don't put it on. You might see some of those video clips now where the background's really in focus. Well, it's because I'm lazy and I'm at f13, something like that. So you say, okay, that's great, but what if I'm shooting my 600 f4? How do I do filters with that? Well, you know, you got drop-in filters. Here. You know, I like to keep my videos kind of organic. Let's see. Nope, wrong one. I got it right here. All right. So, the front element of your lens too big to put on those kinds of filters? Well, you got drop-in filters. And you can get extra filter holders for your 600 f4 in this case, and you can get Freewell ND filters for those. So yeah, so there you go. There's always a solution. Okay, so we talked about filters, we talked about the cooling grip. What else do we need to talk about? Talk about going out and, stability when you're shooting video. Yes, you can use stabilization in post-processing. You can use it in DaVinci Resolve. You can use it inside of Premiere Pro. You can take it outside and use Topaz Video AI. Yep, and it works for the most part. There's some limitations to it, of course. So you want to get as steady a video as possible in camera. I use the 200 to 800 almost all the time for my video. Again, the speed of the lens doesn't matter now, right? So much because, you know, you can shoot video in much darker conditions. Again, it's the shutter speed thing and all that. So the speed of the lens isn't as important. The important thing is having the flexibility of focal length for video. It's so much more important. You want to leave more room around your subjects generally in video. And the image stabilizer on this lens is awesome with these two cameras, the R5 Mark II and the R1. And you can get some really great handheld, stable video. Hand-holding's fine. It's very good for being able to work with flying birds. Hand-holding's always great. But you want to add a little bit more stability to your setup for shooting. This is, and a lot of you probably know about this already, this is the Speed Shooter harness system that I make and sell. And it is fantastic for video work. It gives you the flexibility of hand-holding just about, but more stability even than hand-holding, which again is really important. When we're shooting video, we want, like I just said, as stable a video coming out of the camera as possible. So the Speed Shooter is a great way to do that. So consider that if you want to shoot more video and you like to walk around and handhold things for the most part. Shooting off of tripods, of course. When I'm shooting the Kingfisher, you saw the Kingfisher footage, video footage that shot off of a tripod because we have to shoot off of tripods for the Kingfisher. So we shoot the video from tripods. Works great there too. What else can we talk about? That's about it. I can't think of anything else that we really need to talk about here with video. If you have any questions, of course, comments down below. And got chapters for this video. It's longer. People are always saying stuff about, that's too long, too many words, all that kind of stuff. Your videos are too long. Well, I've got chapters in there. You can watch just the parts that you want. You don't have to watch the whole video. Well, there you go. Hey, until next time, I hope you're having great light. I hope you're getting great video. Be safe out there. I'll see you soon.